Hello everyone and welcome to the final episode in our three-part series on recent developments under the SFDR. My name is Áine McCarthy and I'm the knowledge lawyer in the Dillon Eustace Asset Management and Investment Funds team. I'm joined today by my colleague Cillian Bredin, a partner in that team, who heads up our internal ESG working group. Today we are providing a brief overview of some of the key takeaways from the European Commission guidance issued in March, as well as some of the proposals put forward by the ESAs to amend the SFDR Level 2 measures, which were not covered by our first two episodes in this series. So Cillian, if we look at consideration of PAI at product level first, what has the Commission said on that front?
Sure, thanks Áine. So by way of reminder, the European Supervisory Authorities, or the ESAs, had asked the European Commission in a list of questions that it submitted to it last September as to what was meant by the consideration of principal adverse impacts of investment decisions on sustainability factors at product level. So more specifically, they had asked whether it was necessary for a fund which considers PAI to disclose the specific action taken to address those principal adverse impacts. So as we had expected, the European Commission had confirmed that it wasn't sufficient to simply confirm or disclose the principal adverse impacts of investment decisions on sustainability factors. There is an onus to describe the action taken to address those impacts. Now, the Commission didn't set down any specific criteria as to how those funds should mitigate those impacts, just to be clear. And while funds will likely already have provided information on how they attempt to mitigate those impacts, whether that's through engagement or exclusion, for example. Some may look to revisit the way in which they describe or present that information to investors in the pre-contractual annexes, bearing in mind the Commission's guidance.
Great, thank you. So if we turn to the proposed extension of the mandatory PAI indicators, what can you tell us about that?
So the European Commission had requested that the ESAs take another look at the PAI indicators that were set down in Level 2 measures. And I suppose as a reminder, this is relevant for the Sustainable Investment Test and also for those fund management companies who are required to or choose to report on PAI under Article 4 of the SFDR. So the ESAs have now proposed 4 new mandatory indicators and 6 new optional PAI indicators, all of which comprise of social indicators. So, for example, one of the proposed social indicators is the share of employees earning less than the adequate wage that they've been proposing. Based on the feedback that we're getting, this doesn't seem to be very controversial, but as with everything under the SFDR, there is a potential concern in relation to access to reliable data in relation to those indicators. I suppose in addition to that, the inclusion of additional mandatory PAI indicators may require some fund management companies to look back at their sustainable investment framework to the extent that they utilise those mandatory PAI indicators to carry out their do no significant harm assessment. And it may mean that those fund management companies need to recategorise what had previously been sustainable investments to non-sustainable investments.
Okay, and the ESAs have also proposed addressing the treatment of derivatives under the SFDR, is that correct?
Yes, that's right. So the treatment of derivatives under the SFDR has been a somewhat complex issue since the SFDR was implemented or came into effect in March 2021. So the ESAs have set out proposed guidance on the treatment of derivatives in the calculation of PAI, but also in the calculation of taxonomy-aligned investments and sustainable investments. So they did note in the context of PAI indicators that there was a concern that the PAI of an investment could be understated if derivatives were excluded from the numerator. And then in the context of sustainable investments and taxonomy-aligned investments, so the opposite concern applied in the context that inclusion of derivatives in the numerator could potentially overstate the exposure of the fund to taxonomy-aligned or sustainable investments. So in the case of PAI calculations, the ESAs have proposed that the derivative exposure should be included in the numerator of a PAI indicator unless the derivative doesn't result in the physical investment in the underlying security by the counterparty or other intermediary in the investment chain. On the sustainable investment front, they propose that for long net exposure on any given issuer, the numerator should take into account short positions achieved through derivatives. And then for taxonomy-aligned investments, the ESAs have proposed that net long exposure or net long positions achieved only through derivatives should not be taken into account, while short positions achieved through derivatives to reduce the long net exposure to a given issuer should be taken into account.
Okay, and last thing, the ESAs have proposed overhauling the periodic report and pre-contractual template annexes that have to be used by Article 8 or Article 9 funds. So can you give us an overview of what those changes will look like?
Yeah, I think it's what the ESAs have described as more of a simplification, effectively, of the pre-contractual and periodic report annexes. And really, it's the inclusion of a dedicated dashboard on key information on page 1 of each of those annexes. So the annex will include things like the minimum commitment to promotion of ES characteristics, for example, minimum proportion of sustainable investments, minimum proportion of taxonomy aligned investments, and whether the fund in question considers PAI at product level. But I suppose just from a general perspective, it's probably worth noting that in terms of the consultation itself, that closes on the 4th of July this year. It's expected that the ESAs will present draft legislative proposals in October of this year. So it is unlikely that any of these new rules will come into effect before the end of this year.
Thanks, Cillian, and thanks everyone for joining us today. We hope you found our conversation helpful. Please feel free to get in touch with either Cillian or I with any questions that you might have, or visit our website, dylaneustice.com, for further updates on the SFDR.